With the EPA's designation of asbestos as one of the 10 top priority chemicals for attention under the new chemical regulation law, we have submitted comments to the EPA on what they need to do about asbestos. And the government has the means to do research and so on that go way beyond anything that we could do. So the problem of asbestos is consists of imports of asbestos and asbestos products, asbestos in place, and contaminant asbestos in other minerals like talc and vermiculite. I'm just going to talk about the first of those three, the imports of the products and the asbestos itself. We import about 60,000 50-kilogram sacks of asbestos a year, and comes from Brazil, now that the Canadian mines are closed. It's all used at these 15 ancient chlorine plants. The chlorine plants use the asbestos as a diaphragm in the electrolysis of salt, concentrated salt solution. So the asbestos deteriorates in this, chlorine comes off at one of the electrodes, and the salt is converted to sodium hydroxide or caustic solution or lye, and they sell the lye and they sell the chlorine. And so you can imagine that's a lot of asbestos that's used in this industry. It gets dumped in the environment at the end of the year and gets replaced by another 60,000 bags each year. And there are worker and environmental exposures and environmental hazards throughout. The chlorine industry has its own pamphlet on asbestos hazards in the chlor-alkali industry, and the Chlorine Institute, as it's called. The pamphlet clearly warns about numerous aspects of handling of the asbestos. You have mining and milling, you have the transporting of those 60,000 sacks a year, you have the storage, then they open up the sacks and weigh out certain amounts, and they manufacture the diaphragms, and then they have to remove and replace the diaphragms, and then they have the disposal. And there are lots of opportunities for the asbestos to be splashed on surfaces and dry and create a serious health hazard to the workers and to the community. Safer technology is available. There are companies that have introduced non-asbestos diaphragms using polymer and ceramic fibers. These man-made fibers materials are of such dimensions that the fibers are not respirable. They are too large in diameter to get into the deep lung, so we don't have the same concerns about these materials being toxic. The membrane cell technology is also an alternative to the asbestos and mercury cell chlorine technologies, which are no longer being built, but which are still operating. I think we have one mercury cell plant left operating in the United States. So for the last 30 years, the new plants have all been using these plastic membrane cells, and these have neither problems with asbestos or mercury, and they're more energy efficient, which is a big deal in this industry, which uses 1% of our total energy consumption in the United States, just to give you an idea how much energy this industry uses. And the membrane and non-asbestos diaphragm cells are the only technologies which will be accepted in Europe after December 17th of this year as what they call best available techniques. Now, asbestos is also becomes a food contaminant because the alkali, the caustic soda, the sodium hydroxide, that's the product of this industry, is sold as a 50% concentrated solution. And the alkali is often used, you know, there are acids and bases, and so this is a strong base, and it's used to neutralize acidity in foods. It's used as a direct food additive. So this is a concern because the asbestos deteriorates in the caustic soda solution and then can be a food contaminant introduced thereby with billions of asbestos fibers per liter in the sodium hydroxide caustic solution. I don't know if this industry of asbestos diaphragm cell plants sells caustic soda to the food industry, but this is one of the things we're asking the EPA to find out about. And you can see some of the foods, jams, pretzels, baby foods, even ice cream. As to asbestos product imports, so now I've dealt with asbestos imports. Now I want to talk about products, and these products include brake pads and asbestos gaskets used in automobile engines. These are materials that are no longer made, haven't been made here for 15 years, and yet they're competing. They're coming in from heaven knows where at plants using maybe very few protective measures for their workers. Then this stuff is being sold in the United States. It is supposed to have OSHA warnings on such products, warning that they contain asbestos and cause cancer, and yet I'm concerned that imports of some of these products, given the fact that they're coming from who knows where, being marketed by trading and manufacturing foreign companies that are trading and manufacturing companies. These companies may either not know or not care about putting the OSHA required warnings on the products. And so one of the things that the ADAO has asked the EPA to do is to go into auto parts shops and just use a Scotch tape sampling, opening up the packages of the brake pads and the imported engine gaskets, and get enough material on the tape to then take it back and do an analysis and see whether it has asbestos in it, and verify whether or not these products, if they do have asbestos, are carrying the OSHA warnings that are required here. Imports figures also show that we're importing asbestos yarn and thread from Mexico, over 500 tons over a 5-year period recently. EPA could track this down. They can get the invoices, they could get the records from the U.S. Customs Service, find out who the U.S. importers of these products are, and then see how this asbestos yarn and thread is being used, and whether it's being used in consumer products as well as possibly creating occupational and environmental hazards at the plants where the asbestos yarn and thread are imported. If we had a ban to outlaw asbestos product imports, we would also be protecting American manufacturers of non-asbestos products who are suffering this unfair foreign competition. So specific actions the EPA can take: they can investigate and disclose the records of the worker asbestos exposures and pollution at all the chloralkali plants that use asbestos diaphragms. A lot of these plants under the OSHA regulations have been required to periodically air sample the asbestos exposure in the workplaces, and so they should have accumulated records of what air sampling data they have in terms of measuring the extent of the hazard to the workers. We've seen a few documents from ADAO from the 1970s and from the Chlorine Institute in 1986, showing significant exposures to asbestos in the workers that work in these chlorine plants handling these diaphragm materials. EPA can also press for immediate conversion of all diaphragm cell plants to non-asbestos diaphragms or membrane cells. The non-asbestos diaphragms pay for themselves in 4 years because of their slight energy savings and a much longer service life of the non-asbestos, non-toxic diaphragms. So if the companies could just be pushed a little harder, they could substitute the asbestos diaphragms and use the non-asbestos diaphragms in the chlorine industry. I'm told the industry wants a 2-year payout time in order to spend their own money to do this for purely business reasons. And so we're that close. We have an open and shut case, I think, for regulating this industry and stopping the use of asbestos in this industry. EPA should certainly assure that the sodium hydroxide sold to the food industry comes from diaphragm cell plants that use non-asbestos diaphragms or membrane cell plants. We have plenty of these in the United States, more than enough to supply the food industry with whatever caustic soda, sodium hydroxide it needs. And the EPA should also investigate the imports of asbestos products and see about these brake pads and gaskets, as I said, whether they carry the OSHA warnings. And finally, the EPA should assess the impact of other asbestos products like the yarn and thread. Ultimately, EPA should ban all imports of asbestos and asbestos products. So that's the thrust of what we've had to say to the EPA, and eventually we'll probably have to take them to court over some of this stuff, but first we have to lay out what it is we think they should do as part of the record. Thanks very much.